Good afternoon and welcome to Sense Making Conversations. My name is Andrea Sampson, and I'm going to be your host and guide as we delve deeply into the issues that are impacting us all. During 2020, we all saw our lives changed. What we held on to as normal or regular, from our morning routines, getting up and going to work, to simple hugs with friends, to, handshakes with business colleagues, everything changed. Our world was turned upside down. And for many of us, we're navigating a complex road of emotions. And as business leaders, how do we move forward with visions that were built prior to the global pandemic, where customers are burdened with lockdowns and homeschooling and, in some cases, the loss of loved ones? And for many of us in the business world, loss of business and loss of customers altogether. Grief is a word that we don't often associate with business, yet it's unavoidable as we move into 2021. My guest today is Dr. Sherry Walling, a clinical psychologist who focuses on entrepreneurs. She helps high-achieving people navigate complex and painful experiences. Her podcast, Zen Founder, has been called a must-listen by both Forbes and Entrepreneur magazine and has been downloaded more than 1 million times. Her best-selling book, The Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together, combines the insight and warmth of a therapist with the truth-telling of someone who's been there. She's a mental health advisor to 4 tech accelerators, works directly with a number of startups, and serves on 2 boards. Sherry is an expert in trauma, stress, and burnout, and her research has been published in academic journals. She's a graduate of the University of California, Davis and Fuller School of Psychology, and she holds a PhD in clinical psychology and a master's degree in both psychology and theology. Sherry, I am so incredibly honored to have you with us today. And I'm so interested to hear your perspective on grief and business, especially in light of all the change from 2021. So I thought maybe a great place for us to start is defining what is grief and is it different in a business context?
Grief is one of those really universal human emotions. It's the emotional reaction to loss, to the ending of something, the death of something, the removal of something. And it's a cousin of sadness, but I think grief also has some more complex underlayers. And when we think about grief in business versus grief in life, I'm not sure that it's that different. I think if anything, the griefs associated with our business, it's harder for us to give ourselves permission, right? We have sort of a mental framework of what grief looks like in response to loss of life. But we don't have such a mental framework of what grief looks like in response to loss of business or loss of financial security, although those are, of course, incredibly important losses.
I love what you say, though, like it's a cousin of sadness. When we're thinking about business, and the way in which we as entrepreneurs work, often we're so busy keeping ourselves busy. We're so busy strategizing, filling our days to get more done. And yet, in 2020, we all had to slow down. Our businesses, across the board, every business was impacted in some way. For those who were lucky, it was impacted because it got busier, but that was very few. Most of us saw a different reality. And, while I have been lucky in that I didn't lose anyone during the pandemic, grief and grieving is something that that I've never really thought about. But at the same time, my business was impacted.
Oh, yeah.
And so, as I think about the entrepreneurial journey and entrepreneurs themselves, do you think that they actually let themselves, I'm talking in the third person, and I am one, do we allow ourselves to feel grief? It's like, it felt, even when you and I had our pre-call, for me, this felt so foreign to me. I had never called what I was feeling through all of 2020 as grief. So, am I alone, or is that common?
Well, I think grief in some ways is on the opposite end of the spectrum to the superpower of most entrepreneurs. And as you're describing that entrepreneurial sense of I'm making plans, I'm a visionary, I'm building something, I'm, speaking into the void and making something exist that wasn't there before. That's what entrepreneurs are magic at. And grief in many ways is the opposite. Grief is when the plans have ended, when there's nothing left to do, when there's stillness, when there's quiet, when um, there's emptiness and loss. And so it is really the opposite end of kind of the human existential awareness to be in that grief place. But I think it really is an important, let's call it a practice for
Mm,
entrepreneurs to get a little bit more comfortable with grief because we live in it all the time, right? How many of us have had, we've lost key employees, we've lost opportunities, we've lost clients that we let, these don't have to be these big dramatic pandemics or the loss of life or a loved one. We're losing all the time. And when we don't create the capacity within ourselves to sort of name and acknowledge that sense of loss or grief, I think we run the risk of spending so much time in the external activity, busyness, make, go, 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 that we're kind of accumulating these little wounds that never get tended. We end
mm.
up walking around with, thorns in our feet, but we're not taking the time to heal them.
I think what you're saying is so true and so real. We don't, it's so interesting you say that. Like we're always in a place of loss, right? We always are, especially as entrepreneurs, especially as business leaders, right? Like it's because I could go beyond the entrepreneurial journey and go to a business leader who's experiencing much of the same decision making and impact. And, the reality is we are always losing something, whether it be an employee or a client. Now we're gaining things as well. And I think
Yep.
maybe that, is in past times before we saw the impact of this past year. I think we always had maybe a little bit more of a perspective of balance of, things, yes, we lose, but we gain. And so there was some sort of momentum there. But, in this past year, I think it's been much more focused on that cousin of sadness, grief.
Mm.
And so how do we manage that? How do we, like I was intrigued even by my own thought of like how do we implement visions that were built before the global pandemic. And we can't, as we look forward, imagine what next year or even next month are going to look like. So here we are in this place of grief. We're in the here and now. We've slowed down. We've had to slow down. We've had to start to look inward a little bit more.
Hmm.
So, what do we do as business leaders? How do we manage that?
I think that the one of the very simple practices is simply to name what's been lost. And again, that it makes you sit down, it makes you go slow, get out the pencil and paper, write it out. All of the vacations that you thought that you would be on, all of the experiences that you thought you'd be having with your children, with your friends, with your family members, all of the plans that you had for your business, the hires you were going to make, the trainings you were going to launch, the clients you were chasing. What would it feel like to sit down and actually write those down and spend some time mourning the loss of those things?
Hmm.
The purpose of that is that on the other side of grief, there are important growth points, right? On the other side of looking at all those losses, I imagine that you will experience a sense of self compassion. So when compassion enters, then you're no longer sort of berating yourself for not being able to cast a new vision in these unknown conditions. You're not critical of yourself for the things that you couldn't manifest or make happen in the timing that you expected. Compassion enters after grief and it says, okay, the things that I thought and wanted and chased didn't come to be. How do I let myself tenderly have the space to grieve and then to say, what shall we do now? But without naming it, without feeling it, I don't know that we give ourselves that tenderness. I think that most entrepreneurs will just march on through, go, go, go. What's next? What's next? And we can't continue to exist from that space forever. There needs to be that sense of naming loss, feeling it, tending to it, having compassion, and then you pick it up, you pick up your visions and dreams from a different internal state.
You talk about naming it, and before I go into the next question, I just want to say to anyone on the in the participants, please feel free if you have a question, drop it in. We'd love to hear from you, and you can ask Dr. Walling, you can ask Sherry any question that you would like. Um, as we're talking about naming grief, the thing that as we were preparing for today's call, I remember we were chatting about this, and what I said to you was, we don't want to acknowledge grief. We like so the slowing down, the being in it. We don't want to acknowledge it. I mean, name it. Gosh, I mean, like
What a
that's
terrible idea.
what it like it's horrible. And I think I even said that, like I don't want to call it grief. I don't want to actually name what I've lost.
Yeah.
And you said to me, why? And it stopped me. It stopped me because suddenly I realized that I didn't want to acknowledge it because it would make it real, that
Hmm.
it would make it permanent, that and I think as entrepreneurs and as leaders, as business leaders especially, the one thing that we've learned is that as long as we keep moving, as long as we keep working, as long as we keep trying, we can create a new outcome.
Hmm.
And the naming of it and then making it real felt like the opposite of that.
Yeah.
I don't want this to be real. I don't want this to be permanent. And I also don't really want to give voice to all, that has been taken not only from me, but from so many of us throughout this
Hmm.
pandemic. And I think that's what it was. And so, what can you suggest for those of us who are living in this place, maybe of denial,
Right.
but also maybe of a little bit of fear and panic?
I mean, I think what you're describing is if we can if we can keep the momentum, if we can stay in our entrepreneurial make and go phase, we never have to tell the truth about how vulnerable we are to losing the things that we love. And that's why grief is such an unpopular experience, right? I don't want to face my death. I don't want to face my vulnerability. I don't want to talk about the loss or potential loss of the people that I love. I don't want to believe for a moment that I am powerless or out of control to create the world that I'm working so hard to create. So I absolutely empathize with let's not talk about that.
What part of it?
Because
Like, why would we?
what happens if we don't? I think is my question. What happens if we don't? What happens if we lose big and we roll right over it and continue business as usual? From a mental health perspective, I have some concerns, right? I have some concerns about what we do when we deny those more tender parts of ourselves. I have concerns about what happens when we don't heal. I also have concerns about that as sort of a framework for living in terms of never learning. I mean, we're here talking this way because you've pivoted, because I've learned how to work out a camera and a mic and interact with people on Zoom because damn it, that's what I do all the time.
Yeah.
I didn't want that to be, but what would have happened to my business and your business if we hadn't said, well, shit, like we can't do the things we wanted to do. We better figure out a new path. So learning happens, healing happens, human connection happens when we tell the truth about the fact that like we can't perfectly control the world and we can't manifest the things that we want. Sometimes they just are taken from us. And that's part of being human. I think grief shows up in all corners of our lives. Like this pandemic is obviously an extraordinary experience in our time. But and I know, and everybody on this call knows that we will grapple with grief in some ways, that we will lose parents, that we will lose loved ones, that cancer will enter our story in some way. And I know from professional and personal experience how horrible it can be to enter those stories when we have no capacity for grief. So we have to, as humans,
Mm.
grapple with it in some way or another.
Yeah, and I remember, also as we were chatting, and maybe we, you said something that was really impactful for me. And you said, when we allow ourselves to grieve, and grief is, it's not a linear process, it's something that happens, in its own way. You can't
Mhm.
predict what that's going to look like. But when you allow it, you said to me, there's a happiness and joy that comes on the other side that we can't imagine if we don't allow ourselves to go through it.
Yeah.
And I'm really, I find that such a beautiful thought, that grief can be the midwife for
Mm.
something that is much bigger, that is beyond where we could think. And what I know to be true is that we are always moving on this journey of humanity. Like we
Mhm.
live in this human experience, and we get comfortable in this here and now, and things change all the time. And it's only with movement that we're able to grow beyond what we thought.
Mhm.
But yet when things happen in a way that we weren't expecting them, or that we weren't planning on, that's where we get stuck. That's where we dig our heels in
Yeah.
and want to stay put, even when maybe it wasn't good. And maybe that's something, as I think about as entrepreneurs, are we, and maybe you could talk about your experience with entrepreneurs. Are we so stubborn that sometimes we forget that maybe it wasn't, like, we're romanticizing what was?
It's really interesting that you use the word midwife because when you are making something, anyone who's given birth or has been present or read a book, like it's messy business, right? There's screaming and blood. Like it is not this picture perfect Instagram worthy moment day after day after day. Making something is sacrificial and it's painful and it's messy. So if nothing else, I think as entrepreneurs, we should be really good at this because we know the labor pains of making things, but we don't tell the truth about that very often. And so I think this experience of being ready to be dismantled, to have it get messy, to live in some pain and sacrifice, knowing that there is joy and growth and transformation on the other side, and just believing that. And when we practice it, and I keep using this word practice, right? Grief is something that you open yourself to, you listen to it, you dwell in it, you experience the stillness, you get sort of comfortable there. And you let yourself be dismantled and in pain with the faith and confidence in your own capacity to grow and move past it and to be deeper and broader and wider and wiser on the other side.
Mm. You're really, really accessing those lessons. I see a message coming, or a question coming in from one of our guests. Sue is asking, how do you keep it private and at the same time still be that authentic leader, that your people and your clients expect? Because we are walking this fine line, right? It's like we're showing up every day. It's fine. It's all fine.
Mhm.
I'm doing great. Meanwhile, the world's falling apart. And, so where do we find that line of authenticity while at the same time still being a leader?
Yeah. So I think this is a time, if it hasn't been part of your practice before, this is a time to integrate some of those inner work kinds of spaces in your life, a journaling practice, a meditation, a therapist, because you do need those private places to say, I'm scared to death. I don't know what to do. I'm sad. I'm lonely. I'm alone in this, to talk about those more dismantled, taken apart parts of you. When that piece has an outlet that has some container around it and some intention around it, I think that does allow us to transition, to shift into this other part of us that's also authentic and real, but is hopeful and is motivational and is a leader. And I think about this it really in terms of shifting between these realities. So you have your private life, and then you have your more public life. And there's a different dress code for that. There's a different outfit. Maybe you wear a different ring or a piece of jewelry or something that reminds you that, like, I am in this role right now. And part of this role requires that I infuse some energy and optimism into my team so that they can keep going. You can also look for strategic ways to tell the truth. These are hard times. We're facing, unprecedented challenges. Unprecedented is the word of 2020, right? And now
Absolutely.
2021, still unprecedented. Um, so be very mindful about how you're infusing that authenticity into your public life. But I don't think you can have that mindfulness and intention unless you really have that private space, which again can happen with another human, a coach, a therapist, a journal, a space where you are ugh, telling the truth about all this unwell in you right now.
Mm. I look, I want to just echo that, because I know as I've gone through this past year, as on my own entrepreneurial journey, journaling, meditation, those have been my go-to places of being able to find the safe space for me to go, I really feel yucky today. Like
Hmm.
I'm a student of lots of positive thinking, right? Lots of positive psychology. And so I know the power of positivity, but yet
Yeah.
when you're in the midst of change, when you're in the midst of this craziness, you have to have that one place where you can go and go, I'm not positive here,
Hmm.
in this place, in this
Hmm.
one place. And I can write about all the fears that I have, but I can also in that one place still be positive too when I'm ready for it. And I found that, like, I started journaling, I'm going to say probably in, I think it was June or July of last year. I decided I was finally going to pick up this thing that I've been saying for most of my life I should do.
Hmm.
And I started writing. And what an incredible release it became for me to be able to have a space that was only mine. And
Yeah.
so, I pass that on to Sue and to our other guests to say, writing, that may not be what it is for you, but whatever it is for you, find the thing where you can go, maybe it's working out, punching a punching bag and going, this is where I'm letting my negativity out, because it has to come out. No
Yeah.
matter how much we're trained that we should always be looking on the bright side and always showing up in the leadership role, that that part of you that is grieving needs to have an outlet.
It is energy. I mean, it's actual electrical charge and it does need space for release. And so I'm really glad to hear you also mention the movement of the body because over and over and over I think part of the counterbalance to grief is movement. So whether that's crocheting, whether it's making something with your hands, whether, I love to learn circus arts. So I have a big movement practice, whether it's yoga, whether it's just long walks with your dog, because maybe that's all available though where you live. Um, we can't sort of hold these things statically in our bodies. Our bodies need the movement and they need the intentional space to get it out, whether that's big body movement or intentional, sort of slower movement.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, as we sort of explore this topic, where I get to, and you just started going into that place, so maybe we can go a bit deeper. What do we as business leaders and business owners do to help ourselves acknowledge the grief we're feeling and to move forward? What are some practical things that we can actually employ in our lives?
Yeah. So just review therapist journal. I think it's helpful to bring in some sort of ceremony to grief, which sounds like a strange idea, but I've led a number of companies through a funeral for their company, a memorial service for
Mm.
their company, for a company that's ending, where you do some of the same things that you might do in a memorial service for a person. You tell stories, remember the good old days, our first customer, our first launch, remember the things that we've made. Let's look at our logo. Let's sort of put out the images and the pictures and tell the stories of this business, which is not going to continue. And there's real value in the communalization of that kind of grief. So, God forbid you're leading a business that's not going to continue, you can still lead well through the ending. You can still help people, tell stories, grieve, and have a sense of completion in moving on.
Mm. I think there's something so wise about that. And because what came from my mind is like, I think the one thing that's true probably across the board is that everybody's business is different today than it was 1 year ago. And
Mhm.
so while it may not be ending, what was has ended.
Yeah.
It might be something new. Maybe that's what you're going to, but I think there was, so maybe there's something in that ending point.
And I think marking it is helpful, right? That's
Yeah.
why we have cultural rituals around a service. And, you gather together, you tell stories, you eat cookies, you sort of, pass the punch. Like you have a sense of us, of we-ness, of connectivity. And I do think that's where entrepreneurs have a hard time because often we are the leaders of our organization. And so our peers around us or excuse me, the people that we're sharing the experience with are those that we are leading. So having safe spaces of entrepreneurial peers, of finding people who have similar enough experiences that you can join with them and say, yeah, my business too. This happened in my business. And there are a number of great organizations that help connect entrepreneurs to each other. But having that kind of space for you to feel less alone in all of these feelings where there
Yeah.
can be a truth telling is really, really helpful and healing.
That's a great reminder. I mean, you and I met almost 2 years ago at Dovetail Summit, which
Mm.
was an organization for female entrepreneurs. And I continue to be a member of Dovetail. And so, I think those types of organizations where we have peers who we can connect with, where we can continue to talk to each other in that real sense. Masterminds have tended to be that. So like it's seeking that out,
Mhm.
whether it be, there's lots, entrepreneurs organization, YPO, there's like organizations for women, there's
Yep.
organizations for for small business and large business. But I think it's so important. Community is absolutely, I think, essential in these times, and especially when we are in many ways, isolated and pivoting.
Right, isolated in different ways. And we see this over and over in the psychological literature. Like the number one predictor of how well someone will do in the aftermath of a trauma, whether that's a community disaster like a flood or a tornado, or whether it's something like the loss of a child, the very worst kinds of things that can happen to us, how well we adjust is dependent very much on our social connections. It's the sense of social support and that people care and that they're carrying the burden with us and that we have a community around us. Number one predictor. So,
Mm.
if nothing else, I think that this pandemic is teaching all of us how much we love hugs, but also how much we have to really get very creative about staying connected and engaged with the people we love
Yeah.
because it's absolutely essential.
Sherry, this has been an absolute pleasure. And I know this 30 minutes has just flown by.
Mm.
So I want to thank you. I mean, yes, it's been a little painful at times. I'm
Mm.
not gonna lie as we've delved into it, but at the same time, so incredibly healing to speak with you, to hear your words. This topic is close for me and for many who are in the
Mm.
midst of this, journey through unpredictable times, I'll call it, not unprecedented. Um, and it's been challenging. So thank you for so generously sharing your insight, your experience, and your wisdom with us today. Do you have any last thoughts that you want to end on?
I think just one last thing is to remind us that you won't get stuck in grief, right? If you crack that door open and let yourself go there and begin to sort of sort through and name some of these losses, I promise you won't get stuck there forever. You'll find your entrepreneurial get up and go in a couple days and a couple weeks, but it's not something that you have to be afraid of. It's part of who you are already, just accessing it.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And thank you to all of our guests who joined us today. This brings us to the end of today's conversation. Join us next week, where I'm going to speak with Zara Ibrahim. She's the CEO and co founder of Monumental. And we're going to be speaking about the roles cities can play in building an equitable future. Have an amazing rest of your day. And thank you again, Sherry, for helping us to move forward through this challenging time.